Hi, everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss assessment of the external environment, including the economy, the structure of the industry, and markets that your company serves. And this information is vital because it's really necessary for strategic planners to gather information about the external environment before forming goals and objectives to achieve a more favorable position in the environment and ultimately to develop strategy for accomplishing those objectives. It's more important than ever to do that work, as well as to assess internal capabilities of the firm to pursue objectives by assessing the firm's resources, capabilities, technology, and so forth. And we'll take a look at that second part of gathering the evidence in a separate video. So this one will look at the external environment, and then later on we'll have another lecture on assessing internal capabilities. And with that, I think what I'd better do is just get going here. Let me see if I can pull this thing up. So there we go. So the overview of gathering the evidence includes both the external environment and internal capabilities. You can see that there's a little bullet in the middle entitled Critical Success Factor Analysis. Critical success factors are those capabilities that distinguish winners from losers in competition. And we learn those by analyzing the industry. Once we've done that, then in looking at internal capabilities, we try to assess whether or not the firm has strengths or weaknesses in those particular success factors. But before we do it, we also have to look at critical failure factors that exist as an industry is growing. Certain capabilities become necessary. They evolve with the industry to enable firms to perform the mission that an industry has undertaken to perform. And if the firm can't acquire those capabilities, then it won't make it to the long run where critical success factors will distinguish winners from losers. So we need to look at both of those. And again, once we've identified those, we can then move on and take a look at strengths and weaknesses to use or acquire those critical success and failure factors. At the very end of the second lecture on internal capabilities, I'll also provide you with some techniques to rationalize the results of internal and external analysis by using some matrix and graphic techniques as well as financial analysis. But for right now, we're in part one. If I can get that one up. There we go. So we're going to be talking about the economy, industry, and markets. Very simply, if this is a graph taken from my book published way back in 1999, but there are two dimensions of the external environment. The substantive, which refers to economies, industries, and markets, and chronological. And here again, there are three subdimensions trend analysis, including analysis of the present circumstances, present conditions, forecasting our best guess regarding the outlook for the relevant economies, our industry and markets. And then an acknowledgement that the longer our forecasts run, the more likely it is that we'll be wrong. Almost all forecasts are eventually wrong. So what we need to do is identify possible changes in the economy, industry, or markets that would change our assessment of the firm's performance potential. So we need to assess contingencies, possible alternative futures in the economy, industry, and markets, and prepare contingency forecasts. Not nearly in the same detail as the forecasts we use to do current planning, but as these alternative futures look more or less imminent and more or less important, we'll form some general strategy for responding to them called contingent strategies. And very often in doing so, we have a word for that process, contingency planning. If in the future, one or more of these contingencies becomes highly likely, perhaps even more likely than our prevailing forecast, we can switch out the old forecast and the old strategy and insert into our plan the revised forecasts, which had been contingent forecasts and contingency plans. And we'll get into that later in this course. That'll come up in another lecture. So here's a sample of some of the contents in economic, market, and industry assessments that were done by students in my course who looked at a variety of companies. Three you can see are in the consumer products markets, and one, Deere and Company, in industrial markets. So you might, if you're doing a project in one of my courses, a good idea might be to take a look at this table and see if you can develop a similar set of variables for the particular company that you are working with. So let's take a look at the economy and see how it can be assessed. And I'll warn you right now, there's quite a lot of material in this section. So I'll go as quickly as I can, but this may be a little bit laborious, and all I can do is ask for your patience. Taking a look at the GDP, the gross domestic product, you can see in the upper left-hand corner that it can be quite cyclical. Something else you can see is that in recent years it's been growing less rapidly than it was previously, but lots of cyclicality there, ups and downs. Most recently, the economy's been growing again. Similarly, the unemployment rate is cyclical. The red line is for all women, and the black line is for men. You can see that during that awful recession that we had back in 2008 and 9, the number of people, especially men, who were unemployed reached an extremely high level. Another way that we look at that variable, of course, is the unemployment rate. And you can see that today we're doing quite well. That graph ends in 2018, but for sure, unemployment rates are as low right now as they have been in a long time. Yet another way to look at the economy and employment in particular is to measure the extent to which people choose to participate in the workforce. That's the black line in the lower left-hand quadrant. And the reason people don't participate is that they may have retired, or some women may choose to stay home and take care of the family after they have started a family. Some people actually choose simply not to work. The participation rate then is a function of employment measured by the Social Security statistics and the filing for unemployment benefits by people who are not working. If folks are not doing either of those, they're often omitted from the data. The red line reflects employment and the proportion of people in the population that are working. And you can see that even today, as the employment rate has gone up and unemployment's gone down, there's still plenty of room for people to come into the workforce if they choose to do so. Another reason why they might not do that and might be discouraged is because they lack the skills to meet requirements of job openings. And that is becoming an increasing problem. Here we see another way of looking at the economy, GDP per capita. And the black line has inflation taken out of it. You can see that it's not growing as rapidly as when we don't remove inflation. That's the red line, the so-called current measure. Disposable personal income is wages and salaries less income taxes. And you can see that it has behaved pretty much the same way as GDP per capita. That's good news because when you do your project, if you do one in my course, you will need to gather information about other countries where the company you're studying does business. And one variable that's easy to get is GDP per capita. It's a lot less easy to get DPI per capita, simply because those data aren't always collected in most countries. But the good news is that if you have GDP per capita, you've got a pretty good look at DPI per capita as well, at least the shape of it. Down on the bottom of this exhibit, we have an indication of industrial production and the change in industrial production. You can see during the recession of 2008 and 9 how steeply industrial production dropped. We had a recession sort of like that back in 1974 and 75. Believe it or not, I was in the workforce back then too. And I can remember those as particularly difficult days. Yet another way to look at the economy is industrial capacity utilization. So rather than employment, we simply measure the proportion of capacity that is in use. And again, you can see that during the most recent recession, the proportion of capacity in use fell below 69%. So with capacity utilization rates that low, there isn't a lot of demand for new machinery and equipment. And we'll see later that the production of industrial machinery and equipment has been declining in recent years, and so has the manufacturing employment in that category of industries. You can see that most recently capacity utilization has started back up again, but it's got a long way to go before it gets up to 80%. And it's at that level, about 80% on average, when production of machinery and equipment tends to pick up. So no surprise that production of machinery and equipment has not been vigorous recently. Here's are some consumer measures. The saving rate is particularly interesting because it reflects a lot of things. For instance, if people save more of their income, they may be expecting not to be employed in the future. On the other hand, if they save less, maybe they're more confident that they don't have to save as much. However, there's another explanation for that. And we'll see in some later slides that this next explanation is more likely. And it is that as prices have increased faster than disposable income, Americans have generally just been spoiled. They didn't want to compromise the lifestyle that they'd become accustomed to. And so instead of saving the way they did in prior years, they saved a lot less. Now you see that pickup in the recession, 2008, 9, 10. And what's going on there is banks are cutting people off. They're either foreclosing mortgages or credit card accounts. They're putting lower limits on credit card accounts. And so folks could not dip into the savings that they did not have. They could not they could not spend enough or earn enough to save, and consequently or to unsave, and consequently the saving rate went up simply because people could not spend as heavily and did not have the credit resources to use to spend. And as you can see, as the recovery has started, the saving rate has begun to decline again. And we'll have to see the extent to which saving rate pulls back down to where it fell just before the Great Recession. The other charts here, the chart on the upper right-hand corner reflects changes in prices for shelter and medical care. And one of the nice things about that chart is that these are both very large categories of consumer spending. And generally speaking, prices have not been rising too fast in recent years. So that's one reason why it was possible for consumers to save a little bit more than in prior years. The same pretty much is true for prices of clothing and food. You can see that that black line, food at home, has declined in recent years. I hope you can make that out. But grocery prices have not gone up very rapidly at all. And nor have clothing prices. That's the green line. But if you're eating more meals away from home, then those prices have continued to rise at a fairly steady rate, although you can see that, in fact, that rate's actually come down a little bit. So generally, those items have been fairly consumer friendly. The one that has not been so friendly has been the price of gasoline. You can see that over a number of years until the recession, gasoline prices were rising pretty rapidly. And then the recession took the steam out of that price trend because there was less demand. But also, I hope you're aware that the U.S. has been producing more petroleum using new technologies, which are called fracking, basically pulling oil and natural gas from channels that are not too deep in the ground and easy to gather from, although they don't last nearly as long as deposits of petroleum that are located offshore and in some other parts of the world, such as Saudi Arabia and Russia. But with this new fracking, plus our more conventional petroleum resources, the U.S. has become almost independent and has an abundant source of petroleum, and consequently gasoline prices in recent years have fallen back down. So for all those reasons, we do see that the saving rate has been able to increase. And again, we'll have to see how that fares as the recovery moves on. Here's another measure of the consumer sector. It has a number of implications, not all of which I intend to get into. You can see that the income of families as opposed to individuals, earlier we looked at disposable personal income. That was a personal income for a single individual. This measure is for families. And the black dotted line represents the average for the United States. And the good news is that it's been rising in recent years. Another reason for savings going up. On the other hand, there are some serious social issues in this chart. You can see that different groups of people do better than others or worse than others. One rather interesting line that I will point out here is the red one, which is Asian families are doing best of all. Now, there are very serious social, political issues on this slide. I'm not going to get into those because that's not what this course is about. A good course in political science or sociology should get into those, and perhaps even ethics, but we just don't have time for that. What you can see, though, is that there are these differences, and these differences are relevant for marketing purposes. The way in which producers of consumer products and services market to different groups of people needs to take into account their earning potential and their spending potentials. And you can see that there are very significant differences here. So for that reason, I've shown you this graph. Here are some more indicators of the consumer sector. The upper left-hand chart is really interesting. It refers to consumer credit. And you can see that after the recession, as I mentioned earlier, banks really clamped down, put serious limits on credit cards, and they've been reluctant until just recently to open those gates up again. But you can see that after the Great Recession, the amount of consumer credit for revolving credit, that is credit cards, the red line, as first it declined and then it sort of held stable. So the offset is the black line, which is non-revolving credit. This is loans for cars. It includes, among other things, your student loan and lots of other installment debt. And consumers essentially have found ways to take installment credit to offset the unavailability of revolving credit. I might add that your student loans altogether are now greater than revolving credit cards. And you can see the sharp upturn in the black line, and it's because of the increase in, it's largely because of the increase in student loans. Corporate profits on the right side just sort of round out the picture. It's another important variable in economic growth. As you can see, it also, or that measure also responds to recessions and did so quite dramatically in 2009. And then recovered, but has been flat recently until just a couple of years ago, 2017, it started up again. On the lower two graphs, we can see another form of credit, and that's mortgage debt. The biggest item and the most important is single family credit, and the black line includes houses that hold up to 4 families, but though they are rarely produced. So the black line is essentially single family housing mortgage debt. And you can see that after the recession began, banks foreclosed on mortgages, and the result was that the balances declined and just started up in 2017 again. But that industry really has taken a hit. And we can see that in the right chart on the bottom, where we have residential housing starts. The red line is for single family houses. The black line is all residential housing. And you can see that both the categories dropped precipitously in the recession. And even when multifamily housing began back up a bit, single family housing starts continued to drop through 2011, and even today are far from reaching their prior norms. And in fact, because as new families are formed, they need housing. The gap between the black line and the red line represents the increasing demand for multifamily housing, essentially apartment buildings. So here we have some employment trends. They're important as well, and you can see just how cyclical the construction industry that we just were talking about is. I mentioned earlier that manufacturing employment had been declining in recent years. And these charts go through 2018, so they're quite fresh. And you can see that manufacturing employment has been a very weak sector of the economy. The durables, such as cars and machinery, dropped very sharply and started up again, but they're far from what we would consider normal levels. And manufacturing of non-durables, such as detergent, soap, clothing, It just has not picked up much steam at all. So there's a lot of recovery yet to occur in manufacturing industries. And there are some real questions about that, and we'll be visiting those again, not in just a few minutes. Service industry employment is the bright spot. Incidentally, look at the y-axis, the number of people covered there. It's a lot of people. The service industries are very important, ever more important in this economy. And although employment in service industries also dropped in the recession, they recovered, unlike manufacturing. And the retail and commercial services employment has also shown some pretty significant cyclicality. The retail industries have come out of the recession, but not growing terribly rapidly. So this economy really got hit hard by that recession, and it's only now beginning to pick up. The red line, by the way, is transportation and utilities. They're the result of large investments in capital for heavy machinery and equipment and vehicles such as aircraft and buses and such. So it's a smaller employment or a smaller category of employment and a little less volatile, although even that category did suffer pretty significantly during the recession. Here then are some final graphs regarding employment. The one on the left, you can see the black line is the sum of education and health services. I can tell you that educational employment hasn't been growing nearly as fast as health care employment. And so if we had separated these, and I think I'm trying to remember which source I got this information from, but I can't remember. But the source that I used had these two categories combined, probably made for a little easier job of graphing. But if we had healthcare all by itself, it would be rising at a much faster rate. Notice that professional and business services, the red line, is more reflective of economic cyclicality, and that category also took a steep dive during the recession, but has recovered. Leisure and hospitality, there's an indication where American consumers just didn't want to do without what they'd become accustomed to. And although there was a dip in the recession, not nearly as severe as in other industries. Financial activities and the information industries, such as newspapers, radio, broadcasting, not information technology, but the information distribution industries, you can see their employment's been pretty flat. If we look at the right side of this slide, we see government employment having risen and sort of flattened out. But the big surprise is that the largest amount of government employees are in local governments, just because there are so many more of them. The state governments, there are 50 states and only one federal government. So again, there are more employees at the state level than the federal level. We often hear that the federal level is the largest. And in fact, when we look at spending, we'll see that the federal level is a lot larger than it appears to be when we look at employment. That's because the government does a lot of its spending by paying contractors and American industries to provide services for the federal government. So you don't get a perfectly accurate picture when you look at that chart. But I think the most important part there is to see that the largest category surely is local governments. And if you take a look, they also had to lay people off during the recession. So employment dropped then and has stayed a lot flatter since the recession. So I guess we could say that governments and people are simply less able to make some categories of expenditure than they could before the recession. So property values, sales taxes, and so forth simply haven't been adequate to pay for higher levels of employment at the local level. You can think about where you live and whether or not your government is providing all the services that either it should or that it used to provide. Eventually, we come to grips with an issue, another issue, when we talk about employment, and that's described in the bullet chart at the bottom of the slide. Long story short, whether it's artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, the use of computers to do work that people used to do, there's a real question about the future of work. Much work, for instance, in manufacturing facilities, today is done by robots when that work used to be done by people. In the future, it's pretty likely that we're going to see trucks driving themselves, maybe even before cars, because cars carry people and trucks carry produce. And if something's not going to work right, maybe it's better for a truck to run into a fence rather than a car with somebody in it. Even surgeons are using robotics more. So in a whole lot of industries, automation is replacing people. And that means there's less need for people. On the other hand, the economy is growing. And because, as we will see in just a few minutes, birth rates are declining, families are smaller, there are fewer people entering the workforce. So we need that automation. On the other hand, there are some trades, some categories of work which won't be replaced by automation and computers and robots, at least for a long time yet. So economists are trying to understand what the demand for various categories of labor are. And we'll see in some graphs later on some of the trends in, for instance, employment of professions and construction. Okay, so this takes us then to the notion of cyclicality. I've made the remark as we went through the prior slides that the economic cycle made a big difference in a number of the variables we looked at, and particularly this most recent recession in 2007 to 2009 or 10 really had a big impact on economies, and therefore the demand for industries that perhaps the industry that you and your teammates are studying. And that's why it's really important to take a look at economic trends and patterns in the countries where the companies that either you work for or that you're studying are located. So here are some illustrations of cyclicality in US economic variables. Look at the cyclicality, for instance, in employment of 20 folks in the prime earning years, 25 to 54. It's very cyclical, isn't it? There's a longer cycle in the rate at which people participate in the workforce. That is due to all sorts of variables, including automation, mechanization, education, the ability of people to do the work that is demanded, as opposed to what their current skills are. And so that's a different cycle than the other cycles here in consumer spending. And you can see that consumer spending cycles sort of parallel employment, and of course the unemployment rate. The good news is that currently the unemployment rate is nice and low. However, take a look at this chart. This is a chart that tracks non-residential construction, that is of commercial and industrial buildings. And this industry is quite cyclical. And it's also seasonal, as you can see from the little bumps in each of these years. But the first recession that you see earlier on didn't last nearly as long as the recession that occurred between 2000, what is that, probably 7 and 2011, depending on how you look at it. So the construction, non-residential construction, certainly is cyclical, and it's had peaks as well as valleys. But the intensity and duration of these cycles is a little more difficult to estimate than even the timing. But you know, just knowing that an industry is cyclical helps business planners. And in my career, I've worked in a number of manufacturing industries, among others, and we did a lot of planning based on the anticipation of changes in cycles. However, as you might imagine from looking at this chart, we might have expected a change to occur, and then it didn't occur, or we expected a change not to occur, and lo and behold, we got surprised. So knowing that an industry is cyclical is helpful. Knowing how severe the cycle will be, favorable or unfavorable, and how long the expansion or recession will occur is a little more difficult to predict. This is a chart that I prepared for a lecture some years ago, and I still use it. I think it was prepared in 2015 because its duration ends in 2014. But the purpose of this chart is to explain why people might not have saved as much in some prior years. You can see that these are indicators of price increases with a base year set between the average of 1982 and 84, so call it 1983. The red line is the price of food. Now, you saw earlier that the prices of food recently have come down or not risen as rapidly. And so that's good news. But for a while, food prices were rising pretty rapidly. The black dotted line is the price of housing. The blue line is the price of transportation. The red line, oh, I'm sorry, pardon me. The red line at the top is medical, is the price of healthcare. The red line down here in the center is the price of food. Boy, did I mess that up. And I should have known better because that's well known. So the top line that's growing so rapidly is healthcare, which is why we pay so much attention to Medicare and the like. The red line in the middle is the price of indication for food. Energy is green. And then this black line down here, and I did a little cheating that I have to admit, because whereas these prices here are just that, prices, this black line is price adjusted, but it's disposable personal income adjusted for price increases or inflation. And as you can see in the most recent years, there hasn't been much growth in real disposable income. Instead, more from the family's budget had to come from each of these items. And do you see what they have in common? They're non-discretionary, right? We can't do without health care. We can't do without transportation. We can't do without food or shelter or transportation. So, or energy, gasoline. So it's very difficult to indulge in discretionary items such as new clothing, a vacation, a new car, and so forth. Basic transportation is in this measure, though. And by the way, take a look at how it rose after about 2002. So as these prices increased, it made it more difficult for consumers to purchase discretionary items. So you might want to think about the company that you work for or the company that you're studying, if you're in my course, and ask whether the company that you're studying offers consumer discretionary products and services, those that consumers can get along without, as opposed to those that are non-discretionary, which are essential. So now we'll take a look at the components of the GDP and just sort of focus in on what makes up the GDP. We can see that the upper left-hand chart portrays consumer spending, which represents a little more than 2/3 of the total economy of the GDP. So in 2018, it was 68.1%. So that's a pretty large portion. And so we say that ours is a consumer-led economy. Now, let's take this amount and come over here on the right side. And what do we see? The red line is services. The right line is products, goods. And here, the right line is only 21%. The red line is 47%, making up the 68% total. And so this is a service-driven consumer economy. Whether it's purchasing services from lawyers or accountants, services for transportation, services for education. This is an economy that is dominated by services, and the production of goods is taking up a smaller, contributing a smaller portion of the economy. If we look over at the lower left-hand portion, we get just a little bit more information. The red line indicates the net effect of imports and exports. And since we import more than export, we have to reduce GDP by the amount that our industries do not produce, but that we consume. So in the automotive industry, by way of example, that industry is large, but a significant portion includes imported automobiles. And so that causes us to reduce our measure of the GDP. When we export, it is the reverse. So you can see that the top line non-residential construction, non-residential buildings are at about the within a fairly tight range. They don't move too much. On the other hand, the green line shows the sales of residential property, and as we saw earlier, during the recession, there was a steep drop from which we have not fully recovered. The purple line shows the proportion of the GDP represented by government expenditures, and lo and behold, government spending is certainly not taking up more space in the GDP. In fact, it has dropped proportionally, not as total expenditures, but as a proportion of the GDP, whereas buildings, non-residential buildings, have pretty much held their own. Residential has dropped. Here we have the contribution to GDP of private investment, that is non-government expenditures. And we can see again this decline in equipment, machinery and equipment. There is residential buildings again, and structures other than residential. So we saw those on the prior page. But of course, this is private investment as a percent of the GDP. The one line that rises, and I probably should have just made this graph with this one dotted black line on it, but it represents investment in intellectual property, software, all the apps that you pay for, and just the education again. But investment in intellectual property is the one category where we see steady increases. Government expenditures, as I mentioned earlier, have declined. At least the one category has. State and local expenditures have declined recently, but are in a fairly tight range between 10 and 12% of the GDP. Federal expenditures right in about 3% of the GDP, a little less last year, about 2.6%. But a problem is the defense, our expenditures for defense. And you can see that as proportionately, they have really dropped. And in these difficult times that we live in, all the things that we hear about conflicts between the US and other countries, this is a somewhat disturbing trend because we know that other countries, such as China, are increasing their defense expenditures. And you will sometimes see in the news that the US still spends more than other countries on defense. But think about that for a moment. It's very difficult to compare US expenditures when we purchase military equipment from manufacturers such as Grumman or Boeing, various manufacturers, because they ought to make a profit, don't they? On the other hand, so the prices are high, at least high enough to cover those profits. Manufacturers in China don't make a profit. So we record expenditures by the Chinese government for military purposes, not taking into account that expenditures in China buy a lot more hardware and personal services than US expenditures do. So don't be fooled when you hear that the US is spending more than China does, by way of example, because you need to make a fair comparison before you draw conclusions. Here we have a comparison of imports and exports. I mentioned earlier that our net imports, that's imports less exports, had the effect of reducing our measure of the GDP. The upper left-hand chart here shows the totals of both categories. Over on the right, we show just products, just goods. And you can see if you could measure it and, with a ruler or something, you would see that the gap for goods is larger than the total. And that's because we actually export more services than we buy services from foreign suppliers. So the US has a net surplus of exports of services. US contractors provide services to customers in other countries to a greater extent than US companies buy services from foreign suppliers. But US companies buy more goods from foreign suppliers than foreign suppliers buy from the US. So this gap gets narrowed, and the result is what you see in the upper left-hand corner. Notice also that the scale for services is a lot lower. I think the top line for services in 2018 is about $4.25 billion. The top line for goods and services is almost 13 billion. So you've got to take scale into account. But one way to narrow the deficit, aside from the negotiations that Mr. Trump is conducting with China to have China buy more products, which we need, is also to be more aggressive in offering professional services to foreign customers. In any event, as I said earlier, this is a service economy. This happens to be another one of those charts that I showed to in a lecture a couple of years ago. But you can see that, as I said earlier, this is a service economy more and more, with services representing a larger proportion of the economy and goods producing industries a smaller proportion. To break it down finer, the red line on this chart represents the contribution of manufacturing. And you can see what I was saying earlier. It has really plummeted, hasn't it? On the other hand, the blue line represents finance. And rather interesting is that that line, after growing some time, has begun to flatten or even tail off a little bit. And here we have this issue of automation and the use of computers that are able to do a lot more work that humans used to do. And as a result, the amount of added value that is wages paid for those services has declined. And not a great deal, and it's still a very important category of important industry, contributing some 20% to the GDP. The black line is for professional and business services, and you can see that it has not flattened out. Even though it took a little dip during the recession, it started back up again and had a nice increase there for a while. The green line is agriculture, and you and I are very fortunate to live in an economy where we have abundance of food, even though some portions of our population still need help in that regard. We have an economy of abundance. And so value-wise, it has represented a smaller proportion of the economy than in the past. The black line that sort of narrows off is the information processing and communication industries, and it's a blend of communication industries such as radio and television. On the other hand, it does include the information technology industries, and it's kind of like that other industry, healthcare, and what was it? Anyway, it's a blend of things. If we just looked at information technology, we would see that that line is still rising. Nevertheless, and it's a recent creation of the I believe the Census Department is gathering this, but it could be the Commerce Department of Commerce, but I think these data are gathered by the Census Department. So now let's take a little closer look at the government sector. So the chart on the pie chart on the left represents just federal spending. And here you really can appreciate the problem that exists in the federal government. Let's look for the items here that the government has no option but to make expenditures for, and where these expenditures are likely to keep going up. Well, the wedge on the right, the red one, is for pensions. That's 29%. Is that right? 25%. And it's going to go up, isn't it? Because people continue to retire and live longer. Over on the left, healthcare. And we know that that Medicare and all the other federal health programs are going to continue to be demanded because, again, people live longer and retire. So there's another large category. That one's 27% in the current fiscal year. Defense, 21%, but we'll leave it out for a minute. So far, we've got 25 and 27. That's 52%. Now, we see interest on the federal debt as 10%. So we have to add 10 to the 52, and we're now up to 62. And we've got that light green category up there at the top. That's 7%, and that's for welfare. And so now we're up to 59%. And believe me, there's at least one other percent in there somewhere. So we can say that what did we say, 52 and 10, 62 and 7, 69, about 70% of federal expenditures are mandatory, and they are going to keep increasing. Now, with that said, remember what we saw in defense expenditures as a proportion of the federal budget? It's now at 21%. And what we're going to see in a moment is that not all of those expenditures are for military operations. They also include expenditures for veterans benefits, and those will continue to rise. So as the Veterans Administration grows and needs to grow, it's becoming more difficult to fund military capabilities which are needed in order to defend this country in an increasingly hostile world. And that is a fundamental issue. And it's an issue for defense industries and companies in it, including aircraft manufacturers and armaments manufacturers and engineering firms, for that matter. So this is a problem. Now, if we add state and local government spending, we get the pie chart on the right. And you will see the proportions that I just mentioned to you are generally lower as a result of the larger amounts of expenditures by those governments and the fact that they make expenditures for items that the federal government doesn't. Most importantly, perhaps, is education. You can see education represents only 3% of the federal budget, but altogether, when we add state and local, we get 15% of the total. And if we looked at just the state and local government expenditures by themselves, that proportion would be higher. So that's where the spending comes from. Frankly, for those categories, the 3% at the federal level generally gets transferred to the state and local governments for their disbursement. Another category that's added into the picture here is the transportation and protection, police forces and the like. So when we add it all up, we get a larger amount of which these portions that I talked about at the federal level are not as large. Nevertheless, that's where those expenditures are incurred, are funded to the greatest extent. There is additional funding from tax revenues for health care and pensions, of course, at the state and local level. So we can't disregard that. So now I'm going to run through some charts that simply show the proportions or the makeup of government spending. You can see in the upper left the proportions of federal, that's the red, state, which is the green, and local, which is the gray bar at the top. And the little blue bar that hangs down at the bottom is that portion that the federal government turns over to the states and the local governments. And when you take that out of the federal and put it up at the top, you find out that the state and local government expenditures are about equal to government expenditures. And in fact, the chart in the upper right makes that more apparent because whereas the chart on the left is in trillions of dollars, the one on the right is percent of total expenditures. Percent of the gross domestic product. And as we noticed earlier, government spending as a percent of total GDP has declined in recent years. So government spending is not our problem, contrary to what you may hear. It's elsewhere. However, when we are at a time of national conflict, for instance, here in 1918, the portion of government spending as a portion of the total economy ran up to 30%. And in World War II, it exceeded 50%. So this was essentially a military economy in World War II. So the government went into debt and it contributed a very large proportion of the GDP. You can see in recent years, we have, I don't know if you recall, but we had the War on Terror, and we did a lot of military activity in the Mideast. And you can see the little spike there in 2000, what would that be, 2015, 16, and so forth. So the contributions to the GDP by the federal, which is the green, state, the red, and local, the gray. Do I have that right? Let me see. And well, the transfer payments are blue, recall that. And I'm sorry, the state is the red, the local is green, and federal is the gray. But the federal then is lowered by this blue amount, which is transfer payments. And so if you were to make that adjustment, you would see that the wedges represented by state and local expenditures are just about equal to federal spending, except during those times of war, as you can see. And by the way, that hasn't always been the case, has it? State and local spending has increased faster than federal spending has. Okay. Here then, we see some of the larger categories of federal spending. Pensions, look at those. Already up to $1 trillion and expected to be $1.5 trillion in just 5 years. The expenditures for healthcare exceeded $1 trillion way back in 2014, and they'll be $1.5 billion by 2024. The amount spent on education has been variable and not large as a portion of the federal budget. And look what the expectation is, to come down. Why? It's because all these items that the government can't avoid, that the government has to pay, is taking more and more out of the budget, as it has from defense. See how defense has come down? Now, just recently, this administration has started to increase defense expenditures. And so by perhaps this fiscal year, they will reach $1 trillion. But hold your judgment, because in a moment I'm going to show you that that's not all for war fighting capability. But these are the larger categories, with the exception of education, right? Now, here we have some longer term trends. And in defense spending, you can see that the blue bars represent the ability to conduct military operations. And you can see that those blue bars are still declining as a percent of the GDP. Rising somewhat are veterans' expenditures to make payments to veterans. And we certainly need to make those payments, but you need to be aware that they are included in the defense budget. So our defense budget is not nearly as large as you might think. The little green bar at the top is our government payments to foreign governments to assist in their military operations. Here are payments for welfare. And again, the good news is that as the economy has gotten better, those payments in billions of dollars have come down, and that's very fortunate. The projection is that they will stay at about the same level. And that implies that the folks who made these projections do not anticipate a recession, because in a recession, you can see our welfare payments really ran up. They just about doubled during that last recession. So if we have a recession in the next 5 years, we'll see those welfare payments go up again. Interest on the federal debt is represented by the chart in the lower left-hand corner. And again, you can see how they have just, well, they've more than doubled, haven't they? Or they're going to more than double. This fiscal year, they'll be just about $500 billion. And in 2016, 2017, they were about 250. So we see a really rapid increase in interest due to borrowing by the federal government. And like education, government assistance in transportation has had to be squeezed down due to expenditures of non-discretionary categories. So there are some serious issues in federal spending. Just to finish off on the defense item for a moment, we've seen this long-term chart already in the upper left-hand corner. If we take the portion from 1965 to the current year, and magnify it, we get the chart in the upper right-hand corner. And that really shows how there's been a decline in the proportion of expenditures for defense as a portion of our total economy. And that's an issue. It is for some people anyway. For some folks who don't think that defense is important or think that welfare is more important, they may not feel that that's such an important issue. I, for one, do think it's an important issue. The recent spending then, again, we can see that same chart that we saw earlier, but now the portion for Veterans Affairs is just a little bit clearer in this chart. And again, we see the projection going out to 2024 that we saw earlier. Social Security is one of those items that is crowding out other categories. It's not a large portion of the economy yet. Social Security represents about 4.5% of this year's GDP. OASI is Old Age Security. Let's see, Old Age Security. Blah, blah, blah. Now Old Age Security something. Interest perhaps. But you can see that Social Security payments have been rising as a portion of the GDP recently. Came down during the recession, probably because people were not working and collecting Social Security. And therefore, during this decline, you see that Social Security outlays for disability payments, whatever, disability insurance, that's it, old age security insurance, disability insurance. So when people were not working and collecting Social Security, many went to the Social Security agency and complained that they were injured or ill and could not work and claimed disability insurance and received it. Now that we have an economic recovery and people are working and collecting Social Security again, their claims for disability insurance magically have declined. I'll leave it to your imagination to explain that. Here then are outlays for Medicare. The blue is Part A, that's for the hospital. Red is doctor bills and hospital bills. Part C is a combination of A and B, where hospital and doctor bills are combined in all healthcare, except for, and the red includes some prescriptions. The gray, Part D, includes additional payment for medicine and drugs prescriptions. And forget the details, the components. Just look at how this total has been rising, and it's going to continue to rise. So neither of these is a large amount, is it? But when we add them all up, we've got Social Security at 4.5 and another half or more for disability. So we're up to 5%. And then we have over 3% for Medicare. That's 8%, and a little more all told. And that's going to keep rising. So again, the question is, which of these expenditures can we do without, or what other expenditures, such as defense, can we do without in order to keep making these payments or other payments? And the government's got a real problem there. All right, now we've finished the economy, and I'm going to get into analysis of markets. And markets pretty much are made up of people. So here we have graphs showing the growth of the nation's population in the upper left-hand corner. And what you see is something rather interesting. And that is that births, while exceeding mortality, are not growing as rapidly as mortality. So the growth rate of what's called the natural population, these purple bars, is declining. In order to keep making those Social Security payments, we need a little larger workforce. And that's a problem, isn't it? And when we go over to the upper right-hand chart, we see that it's not going to get better. That children under 18 that we need to, that are not working, are going to no longer be larger as a proportion of the total population than retired adults who are over 65. Unless the retirement age increases. But by about 2034, perhaps earlier, we will see the number of retired people exceeding the number of kids. Yet, you know, it's the category in between where we need to generate Social Security payments, and that's why we need to look at this chart at the lower right-hand corner. And the orange bars there represent the growth rate of the natural population. And you can see that it's been recently about 1.5%, a little less. By 2030, it'll be 1%, and by 2040, only 0.5%. How are we going to make up the difference to provide the manpower that is needed to for employment in our industries? Because we'll still need manpower, and to make Social Security payments. And the answer, obviously, is immigration. And so the growth rate in population right now is almost the same. And if you, like me, believe that we don't record all immigration, it's very possible that immigration really is about equal to the growth of the natural population growth. By 2030, immigration will exceed natural population growth for sure. And after that, it will eventually be twice as important. So whether some people in our society like the idea of immigration or not, they'd better get used to it and look on it more favorably What we need, is, of course, are immigration policies that promote our economic welfare. And today, that's not necessarily the case. But that's where our population's growth will be coming from in the future. This chart in the lower left just is there to demonstrate another reason why the birth rate is declining. It shows the proportion of women aged 30 to 34 that are deciding not to have children. And each of these lines represents a different category. The total, and I'm sorry, the title on this chart is wrong. The blue line is age 30 to 34, and you can see it's a large portion. It's over a third. The portion who have grown to age 35 to 39, some of those people who haven't had children by the time they're 34, by the time they're 39 they have, and age 40 to 44, the proportion drops to about 15%, so it drops in half. Nevertheless, we expect that people who are 40 to 44 years old are less likely to have children in the future because child rearing and family management are simply expensive. Incidentally, the break in the lines here is because the Census Bureau adopted new measurement methods in, what was it, 2012. Had that not been the case, this blue line would have picked up from where it left off in 2012, and you would see the proportion to be a lot higher. Whether one method is better than the other, I don't know. But I think you and I can agree that the trend to not having kids is growing. And that's why we see the proportion of the population being increased due to births is actually decreasing. The proportion of population additions from births has decreased because more women are deciding not to have children. And that's another reason why if we want to maintain our workforce, we're going to have to look more favorably on immigration and an intelligent immigration policy by the government. Here's another way to look at population, and it's by age group. So these lines run up to 2010. You can see that the red line represents the baby boomers, the folks who were born right after World War II. And as they were born, they grew rapidly. We referred to the baby boom generation as a boom. Lots of kids were born. And then 10 years later, they no longer were 25 to 45, they were 45 to 64, 20 years later. And so that's what the black line represents. This black line is the same as the red line 20 years earlier. By the way, be careful not to infer, to read this chart the wrong way. Here we've got 20 years between 25 and 44, don't we? We have 20 years between 45 and 64, but between 5 and 15, only 10 years. So it's no surprise that there are fewer people in that cohort or population group. And the age groups between, let's see, 16 to 19 are here. And that's only 4 years. So again, no surprise that this line is lower, but you have to appreciate there are fewer people in it. Incidentally, take a look at the growth of seniors. This isn't due just to the numbers of people being born. It's also due to medical technology and longevity. And we can see this group of 65 and older increasing. Now, if we move forward to the present and the future, there are those seniors, and look at them go. So between now and perhaps 2035, the rate of growth of seniors in the population is going to be really important. And so again, why are we looking at these charts? Well, marketing people, folks in the consumer products and services industries, they really take this, these lines, these graphs, seriously. This means that there's going to be greater demand for healthcare. This means there's going to be greater demand for travel. This means that there's going to be greater demand for housing that is most convenient for seniors and so forth. So this is a major market, this market consisting of seniors. And even after it slows down, it will keep growing to the point where at the end of this chart in 2050, it will include more, substantially more actually, than 80 million people, about 90 million people. That's a lot of people. This group in 45 to 64, the good news, it's going to decline for a little while, and is declining right now. Not a great deal, and it's still a large number of people. And these are the people in their prime earning years. However, take a look at this. It's not a growing market and won't be for at least another 5, perhaps even 10 years. So that tells folks in the consumer products and services industries that this is not a growing market segment. On the other hand, folks who are entering the workforce, including those immigrants, are increasing in number. And so, but again, how much do they earn? Where are they located? We'll take a look at that later to see where they're located. But this is a large growing market segment. And then we have these other categories, including school-age people and folks who are in college ages. You can see that, college age. And you can see that that population group, the one that you're probably in, hasn't grown very much at all in the last 10 years. It's about to start growing slowly from about this point on. So the demand for services rendered by colleges, as well as related services, perhaps publishers, online educational services and the like, maybe the demand for those services will increase. The demand for primary school services looks like it's going to be headed pretty steadily upwards for the foreseeable future. Not rapidly, but steadily. So folks in consumer products and government services, healthcare services, really look at these charts closely and study them and reproject them. Here's just another chart to confirm what we've already seen, and that is the number and proportions of people 65 years and older has been rising. This chart only goes to 2010. I used it in a lecture earlier, but it's just a nice graph that shows how it grew, leveled off, and now we know that it's growing rapidly again. But the U.S. isn't the only one with this problem. Down at the bottom, we have what's probably a more important chart here. Whoops. The top line here is the portion of Japan's population 65 and older. And you can see that it's currently about, 26%. It's over 25%. More than a quarter of Japan's population is 65 and older. Europe's population is the line under that one, and it's now at about 20%. Our population is the next one down, and it's at about 15%. We saw that earlier. So, but our population will probably get up there. Our senior population will probably get up at the same level as Europe's and perhaps even Japan's. So by looking at their experience, we can appreciate that this is a problem that's not going to get any easier. Now, Japan's problem is exacerbated by the fact that it has very low levels of immigration. And our population, of course, is replenished by immigrants. This is a country of immigrants, really. Our history is and our folklore is all about immigration. But Europe has immigrants, but in total, proportionately until recently, not the same proportion as the U.S. So the U.S. is likely to get up closer to Europe, but probably not Japan's level. So here's what we're looking at in the future. In 1960, you can see that nice Christmas tree affair or figure showing the proportion of the population represented by various age groups. And although I said the word proportion, the proportions are shown, this happens to be in millions of people. And so as they got older, there were fewer of them. Now in 2060, you can see that the break that occurred here in the perhaps 45 to 49 category is happening all the way up in the 70 to 74 category. And whereas these graphs end at 85 to make this nice Christmas tree-like affair, to make the same thing, we'd have to push the 2060 figure all the way up to well over 100 to get the same effect. And so we've got these large numbers of people who are 65 and older, substantial proportions. And if we added them up, it would be a very large portion of the population. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important for marketing reasons, as I explained earlier, but it also is important politically because people at older ages have higher voting rates. The top line on this chart is the proportion of people 65 and older who vote, and it's about 70%. Well, let's take a look at 65 and older, and here they are. It's a large portion. See, back in 1960, it wasn't such a large portion, was it? But today, it's a much larger portion, and in 1960, it'll be even larger. Well, what about those 45 to 64? These are the people in their prime earning years. Their kids are probably away from home now, even though they're having kids at an older age. They're able to to appreciate just their lifestyles a little more. And although they were voting at about 75%, they're now down around, oh, what is it, maybe 68%, but 2/3 of them vote. So if we add those, 45 and older, where do we have it? Look at the chart for 2060 versus 1960. So if we simply take into account people 45 and older, we can see that our politicians are going to be much more responsive to folks who are mature and or seniors. To make matters more problematic for younger adults, you can see that their voting rates have really declined recently. They're down to a little less than 60%. And folks in your age category, 18 to 29, only about half of you vote. And so not only do you represent a smaller portion of the population to whom our politicians have to respond, but you are less likely to impose your will or your desires on our elected officials. And so those officials, those folks who are elected, they know where the grease is. They know that the cheesecake is in the 45 and older category, and that those folks are more likely to vote than people who are younger. And those people who are younger, therefore, not only represent a declining portion of the population, but an even faster declining portion of votes. So you can bet that they're going to be appealing more and more to matures and seniors. Here's another way to look at the population, and it's to take a look at where people are moving. Now, where people move, of course, is where industry moves, so where there are jobs. And so the top 10 cities on this chart are in what we call the Sun Belt. They're largely in the West and the South. You can see Raleigh, North Carolina is number 10 on that list. Now, this list was made in 2010, but it's probably still pretty valid. Well, it wasn't made in 2010, but it measured the change of population during the decade of the 2000s. And you can see that the numbers of people under 45 grew pretty substantially in the Sun Belt. That's because there were more opportunities for employment. The number of folks 45 and older also grew, but did not grow generally as fast. A little exception is Cape Coral and Fort Myers, Florida. No surprise there, that's a retirement community. Now we go down to the bottom 10. These are cities in what we call the Rust Belt, where industry used to be located, but many of those industries have closed. Youngstown and Pittsburgh are famous for their steel producing industries, or the steel producing industries that used to be there. I used to travel into those regions in the steel industry where I worked quite a bit as a consultant. And I can tell you that the steel producing facilities that I used to visit there are closed. They're not there anymore. Cleveland, the same way. Rochester, for different reasons. Syracuse, Detroit, cars, and so forth. So this is the Rust Belt. This is where heavy manufacturing used to be, not in the West, and certainly not in the South, with the exception of New Orleans, which suffered due to the great flooding they had there. And so you can see that folks under 45, including people your age, got out of there. They went up here where they're to the Sun Belt, where the employment opportunities were greater. The growth of folks 45 and older, those proportions increased drastically. Why? Because once they were there, they had no options other than hopefully to stay in their jobs and keep their jobs if they could, whereas the young folks moved to where opportunities were greater. So again, if you're in the consumer products or services industries, by way of example, the food service, restaurant industries, or the hotel industry, or the entertainment industry, you're much more likely to be looking for locations in that top 10, those top 10 cities rather than the bottom 10. If you're a manufacturer and you want to locate a facility where you're going to find adequate employment, you probably don't want to go to those bottom 10. So the bottom 10 cities in the Rust Belt, they have their problems, whereas those in the Sun Belt have fewer problems. All right, now we'll get into what it is that's driving some of these trends in the population. And as you can see from this chart, we see that the people who have not married, and these are people who are 18 years of age and older. 15% never had married in 1960. That portion doubled by 2010, and it's continuing to grow. So today it's probably 30% or more. We can see that the number of people who were divorced or separated were only 5% in 1960, but by 2010 that portion had almost tripled, and today it certainly has tripled. So the portion who were married, almost 3/4 back in 1960, about half, and probably easily down to 50% by today. So from almost 3/4 to half in those 50 years. So this is a long-term trend, but it's definite. Another thing we see is the age at which people do get married in the lower chart. And you can see that it's been rising quite rapidly to the point where men who get married today are almost 30 years old, 29. Boy, does that make a big difference for home builders, right? If folks aren't getting married until their late 20s, they've had a chance to get a job, to be employed, to save some money. They can afford a little nicer house than people could when they were getting married in their early 20s. Again, the purpose for going over these charts is to consider what the economic and marketing consequences will be, and what forces are acting on industries, in this case, such as home building. Here in the upper left-hand corner, we see that same graph over a longer period of time. The graph in the upper right reflects people who are deciding to live together, just not get married. And that proportion is now up to about 10% of the population. I'm sorry, about 12% of the population. It represents some 18 million people, not a large portion of the population, but you can see that they are growing, and we'll see what that trend, you can see it's sort of stabilized. We're not sure exactly what's going to become of it. I would bet it continues to grow. I won't get into my reasons why, but that is my estimate. The proportion of folks who are between 18 and 34 years old who are married back in 1975 was 59%. But by 2018, it had dropped by 29%, about half. We saw that earlier, didn't we? But this is a rather dramatic bar chart, isn't it? So folks up to the age of 34, less than a third were married last year, as opposed to almost 60% in 1978. 40 years earlier. Now, in this chart on the lower right, we've got folks who are able to earn 40,000 or more, and those among 18 to 34-year-olds, those same folks that we looked at a moment ago, who are either married or not. And we can see that the unmarried group, a much smaller portion, only 20%, were making 40,000 or more, whereas twice that amount, 40%, who were of the married adults aged 18 to 34, had incomes of 40,000 or more. Now, watch out how you interpret this chart. Does this mean that getting married will enable you to settle down and work harder and earn a higher income? Or does it mean that people don't get married until they are earning enough to afford forming a family, buying a house, and so forth? And frankly, it's probably a little bit of both. Again, this is not a course in sociology, so we won't go any further than that, other than to observe that folks 18 to 34 are more likely today to be able to afford a little higher lifestyle. Interesting chart. I used this one also in an earlier lecture, but this was a survey done by the Pew Research Center, which is highly regarded, so we can trust their numbers. And what we see is that folks your age tend to believe, almost half of you believe, that marriage is becoming obsolete. Indeed, folks who are up to 49 years old, 41% of those believe marriage is obsolete. And then the proportions who believe marriage is obsolete at later ages drop. That's because more of them are probably married. But surprisingly, folks 50 to 64, more than a third of them believe marriage is becoming obsolete, and almost a third of folks who are 65 are overdue. So no doubt about it, people seem to be perceiving that marriage is becoming obsolete, and therefore there's a question. Do they therefore believe that it's okay to be part of that group up here that are living together but not getting married? And that's an interesting question. Another interesting question is, do people who are college graduates share the same opinion? And clearly they don't. Over a quarter of college graduates believe that marriage is becoming obsolete, but those with some college and don't have a degree, over 40% of them believe marriage is obsolete, and then 45% of those with, without any college, high school or less, believe it. So This is, I think it's a little difficult to categorize people in their education levels. But again, we have to be careful to interpret this information. Are these college graduates the ones who are making larger incomes and therefore can afford families? Is it possible that these are college graduates, in fact, are in family units, whereas folks in these other categories are not? And indeed, that is the case. So you have to be very careful in interpreting these charts. Now, let's take a quick look at industry analysis, and we'll wind up this rather long lecture. But here we're going to take a look at ways in which to analyze industries and competition. And here's a little list of some of the ways in which that we can look at population, at industries in order to assess our competitive circumstances. So we could look at our industry's growth potentials. We could look at competition. We could look at what Michael Porter calls strategic groups, and I'll describe those in a moment, but different groups within an industry. We could look at the industry's stability. We could look at what's forcing change to occur in our industry, and we could look at our industry's profit potential. And in fact, Michael Porter gave us his 5 forces model of forces, economic forces that drive industry profitability. You need to do this analysis if you're doing a project. You need to do this analysis for the industry that you're studying. Pardon me, I just took a drink of tea. The most important of these 5 forces most definitely is competitive rivalry. And as rivalry goes up, let me just put that on the screen real quick. As rivalry goes up, the rate of return on invested capital goes down. Again, one of the beneficial parts of looking at Porter's model is that over the years, this model was first put out at around 1980. So there's been plenty of time to do research and confirm this model. And that research did confirm this model. So as rivalry goes up, profitability goes down. Now, to make matters worse or to add further pressure on profitability is the threat that new companies will enter the industry. And you can imagine that'll happen earlier on in an industry's history and its life cycle. But what that'll do is upset the supply-demand balance and push prices down and force you to lower your company to lower its prices or increase costs to improve quality or customer service, what have you. Another possibility is that there are industries other than your industry that make products that can provide customers, be they industrial firms or consumers, with similar benefits. So a company that I worked with quite a while is PepsiCo, and another one is Holiday Inn. In both of those cases, you can think of industries that compete with their industries. For instance, in the soft drink industry, we can think of wine, we can think of beer, we can think of fruit juices, we can think of tea. You may not think tea is very important, but if you were in India, it would be more important than carbonated beverages. And coffee, of course, which is extremely important. So some industries can offer substitutes for what your industry offers. In the lodging industry, just think of all these bed and breakfast types of firm that are opening up. And in the taxi industry, competition now includes Uber and Lyft and so forth. So substitutes are becoming more important. This is also true in industrial products, where a variety of different kinds of machinery sometimes can provide similar benefits. Another force that can push profits down is customers' bargaining power. If customers are fewer than the number of suppliers, and let's say that your firm is one of those suppliers, if there aren't very many customers, then you're going to have to compete real hard with your competitors to get those customers business. You're probably going to have to cut your price or increase the cost of customer service to win their business. Alternatively, it might be that there are very few suppliers for a particular component that goes into what your product, your company produces. In which case, again, you're going to have to pay more for those suppliers' products or services than otherwise would be the case. Again, pushing your profit down. So all of these five forces can decrease profitability of an industry. Now, here's a little chart. It's an old one because the bubble that shows generic drug manufacturers doesn't include Teva, a company in Italy, in Israel, which is the largest generic drug manufacturer of all. But be that as it may, this chart suggests that there are two groups of drug manufacturers, and that their strategies differ dramatically. The companies that do research and development in order to produce new drugs invest a great deal in research and development. Once they develop a new product, they are protected by patents for 17 years. And they can keep their prices up in order to recover their research and development costs and thereby fund new research and development. Once those patents run out, generic drug manufacturers have entirely different strategies, don't they? Those strategies are all about mass production, automation, mass distribution, and so forth. Their strategies will differ dramatically. And indeed, if we did a five forces analysis of these two strategic groups, we would find different loadings on the five forces, at least some of them. And Porter told us that the way we can be sure that we have a separate strategic group is to do a five forces analysis on it. And if we come out with a different set of loadings than we do for another group in the same industry, then by definition, we have a different strategic group. You should take a look at the industry that your company is in to see if you've got more than one strategic group. Here is a list, incidentally, and I might have shown you this earlier, of factors that can increase competitive rivalry. And my suggestion to you is to print this slide off and use it as a checklist to measure the intensity of rivalry in your industry. And based on your conclusions, you can then come up with a score for the intensity of rivalry in your industry, and thereby to estimate what the impact on profitability will be. Okay, we'll now move on to the industry life cycle. This is the industry life cycle. And you can see that industries often go through 5 stages. First, when they are get started by just one company, right? It takes a single company to start an industry. If what that company develops looks like it's successful, it'll be joined by other companies. If it continues to succeed, then more companies will enter the industry, and that industry will grow as demand for its products and services grows. Eventually, the growth rate may outstrip production capacity, and or there will be a recession, and a shakeout will occur. And then Darwin does his little game, his magic trick, and only the fittest survive. And many companies drop out in the shakeout stage. And then fewer companies remain in the mature stage. And whereas a lot of investment and marketing and capacity expansion is required in the growth stage, less of those kind of expenditures are required in the mature stage. So this is often a stage where a lot of cash flow and profitability occurs. Now, many industries over the years will then decline, and that's when more firms will drop out. That's because those industries are being substituted by other industries that provide the same benefits and eventually an industry may entirely terminate. On the other hand, some industries don't enter the decline industry. Are you still using soap? Well, if you are, you know that the soap industry has entered the mature stage and it's still going on. And there are a lot of industries that enter the mature industry or the mature life stage and life cycle stage and then just remain mature. So not all industries go into decline, but many do. Essentially, that's what this bullet chart says. I just told you what's on this chart, so I'll move on. One thing that does happen as an industry is just starting out in the growth, embryonic and growth stages, is that a company will start out as a first mover, and then over time, the industry will mature and more companies will come in. And the first mover gains experience and practice over time, and it gets better, it gets more efficient as a result of that experience. And so as they learn, their rate of cost declines. Other firms, meanwhile, come in at the early stage and they work their way down, and then others follow them. And so until technology changes, first movers can have an advantage. Now, eventually what will happen is that this curve will flatten out, and that's because the industry reaches the maturity stage. So once we're at the mature stage, there's not much more to be gained from learning, and all competitive advantages from experience are competed away. And first movers, second movers, and third and fourth movers generally have the same rate of cost. But early on, first movers may have a competitive advantage. So this takes us to the punchline for this lecture, and the last slide, I'm pleased to say. And I'm sure you're pleased too. And that is that in this life cycle, firms develop capabilities. And it's not just because they're first movers, but every industry has certain capabilities, be it resources, skills, accumulated knowledge, in order to perform the mission of a particular industry. Some firms do a good job at acquiring those capabilities. to perform the basic missions of an industry or the basic mission. Others don't. And if they don't do an adequate job, they will be eliminated in the shakeout stage, right? Here's where firms fail to pass through this screen of critical failure factors. So a firm must not have certain flaws, inefficiencies, perhaps inability to produce adequate quality, the ability to meet customer requirements, certain technological capabilities, and so forth. But these are the basics and that are required to be a contender for industry leadership. And firms have to pass through this screen, kind of like fish swimming through a net. You know, here we are the contenders, the ones that made it through. Now, what is required to be a winner is to have certain critical success factors. And these factors are different from the critical failure factors. They often include more sophisticated technology, extreme efficiency, and or cultural advantages. But there usually aren't that many critical success factors that separate winners from losers. But the cluster of those critical success factors, the few things that winners can do better than others, distinguish them from losers. And you can take a look at an industry that is in the stage of maturing, and you can take a look at those companies that are doing better than those that are falling away. And you'll see that the ones that are winning are better at certain capabilities. They have certain resources and skills that the winners don't. And there usually aren't very many of these critical success factors. Now, textbooks, strategic management textbooks, love to talk about critical success factors. Rarely, if ever, do they talk about critical failure factors. And yet it's the critical failure factors that account for firms falling away during the shakeout phase. So you need to be aware that they exist. Now, what I need to be aware of is how I can possibly bring this screen back up to the point where I can talk to you rather than show you this slide. And unfortunately, I've been having difficulty with the control panel on my system. So if I can't bring it up real quick, I'm going to end this session, this recording, so that you don't have to sit and watch me any longer. As a matter of fact, please feel free to turn off your video player right now. That is the end of this lecture. And the next stage or the next lecture, we'll be getting into methods for analyzing internal capabilities. And that lecture won't be as long as this one. So with that, I'll simply try to look at you from my little portal over here and hope that this lecture has been helpful to you in understanding the methods that we use to assess the competitive environment in which the firm that you and your teammates will study, or frankly, the questions that will be asked in a quiz on external environment. So with that, I'll simply say goodbye. Goodbye.